Yo, you ever have an insatiable urge to complain about arms? Well, today, I'm gonna get to do it. Let's see when I get to do it. Well, what am I supposed to do until then? Nintendo and fighting games. Something that Nintendo struggles so hard to get right, and when they did get it right one time, they viewed it as the biggest mistake they ever made. Put him down. Obviously, Nintendo's main fighting game series is Super Smash Bros., and it is a masterclass of game design. One of the few games where playing both casually and competitively are equally fulfilling experiences. But with Nintendo being around for so long, this isn't their only attempt at creating a fighting game. But it fucking should have been. Throughout the years, Nintendo has made many fighting games across varying systems and varying genres. So let's go ahead and take a look at them and see if we can find the good, the bad, and the arms. Only makes sense to start at the beginning, so let's take a look at Nintendo's first ever fighting game, Urban Champion. Urban Champion successfully simulates the streets of America when we abolish the Second Amendment. Urban Champion is an NES game released in 1986 that people hated at the time, but Nintendo keeps re-releasing it anyway. I guess Urban Champion fans are just worth more to Nintendo than Earthbound fans. The goal of Urban Champion is to knock your opponent across multiple screens and eventually into the sewer. It was an incredibly simple game, even for the NES. Your options are block low, block high, punch low, punch high, or give in to your shit-based fate. So it's not super fun to play with your friends. And even if you wanted to play on your own, the AI is absolutely terrible. The reason this whole game is so basic is because it was actually based off of the Game & Watch game Boxing. For some fucking reason. It really just didn't make sense to make this game. I mean, Nintendo was aware that NES games and Game & Watch games are in two different levels, so why would you essentially just port a Game & Watch game to the NES? I think it's because this is one of the more complicated Game & Watch games, and the controllers for it bear a passing resemblance to an NES controller. Where is the line on racial stereotyping controllers? Which obviously isn't a good enough reason to justify making a game. It's basic, it's not fun, and its reviews did reflect that at the time, so it mostly flew under the radar. Until Nintendo decided to bring it back with camera angles. They brought the game to the Nintendo 3DS in the 3D Classics line of games. A line of NES games that were remade for the 3DS with unique camera angles. This was an incredibly limited line of games, with Nintendo only re-releasing 6 games in the 3D Classics line. So why the hell did they pick Urban Champion to stand next to Excite Bike and Kid Icarus when a 3D Zelda would have sold insane? It was a bad game, even for the 80s. What made them think camera angles were what it was missing? Nintendo did fail miserably on their first attempt at a fighting game, but there is another NES fighting game that you probably don't know about, and it features easy jokes. Joy Mech Fight is one of the most impressive NES games. The NES didn't feature very many fighting games because it was incredibly difficult to make them work on the console. The NES is an incredibly weak console. I agree. The NES can't handle the large and complicated sprites that fighting games are based on. An NES sprite can only occupy a small space on the screen, and each sprite can only have 4 colors, which is pretty much 3 since transparency is its own color. And with games like Street Fighter needing an entire tile for Chun-Li's ass, it's not realistic to have fighting games on the system. And without being able to use large, complicated sprites, you end up with games like Urban Champion. So none of the fighting games on the NES ended up being very good, but Nintendo managed to figure out a solution: forceful removal of limbs. The characters in Joy Mech Fight are made up of these multiple smaller sprites instead of one big sprite. And you can use all these small parts working together to create a full-fledged fighting game character, minus the sex appeal. And it is a full-fledged fighting game. It's got multiple characters, all with different basic attacks and various input attacks, and even secret attacks the game doesn't tell you. It's, in theory, an interesting fighting game. But there is one problem with this fighting game. There's no walls. If you haven't played many fighting games, you might be a dumbass, but this is a big deal. Because without walls, there's technically nothing stopping you from getting a very slight lead and running away for the entire match. But Nintendo had a genius solution for this: massive burst of movement attacks. Attacks that send you forward or burst movement attacks are not uncommon in fighting games. They are often on more aggressive characters to help them get in, or in some cases even get out of danger. This means that your opponent has to be constantly alert to the fact that you could be in their range at any moment. I would like to advise all women to make the same assumption about me. But enjoy mech fight, everyone has them. So every character's actual range that they can fight at is actually the entire screen. This does lead to pretty polarizing fights where you're both terrified of the other person's movement options, and while it does mean that running away isn't a valid option, it also means that fights can get really chaotic once up close with you and your opponent bouncing everywhere, and if it doesn't go your way, you can take a lot of damage in a very short time. So you end up playing really passively anyway to ensure you don't get fucked up by Bok. It's not a bad game. There's still a lot of very interesting interactions you can have once you get up close, like with women, but getting up close is rare and incredibly difficult to achieve without consequences, like with women. So that's it for what the NES had to offer in terms of fighting games, and Nintendo would generally avoid the genre for a while, understanding that Capcom and Namco were really running the show in terms of fighting games at this point, and Nintendo generally likes to be at the top of a genre. They technically published Killer Instinct during this time, but I feel like it doesn't count because Nintendo clearly didn't have a say in it, and Rare was pretty quickly purchased from Nintendo after this release, so it's not a Nintendo franchise anymore. But despite all the time they spent avoiding the genre, nothing can stop Nintendo from having a bad idea. And believe me, I've tried. After Smash Bros., they made 2 more attempts at making fighting games. They created Custom Robo and Photo Dojo. We'll start with Custom Robo. AI robots instill great fear into me. What if they are good at flirting? Custom Robo is a Nintendo series that many people will not have heard of and kind of warrants its own entire discussion. But we only need to look at the versus mode in this discussion. The versus mode is directly based on the single player game. They all take place in this box called a Holosseum. It's got a lot of terrain that can be played around and create interesting interactions. But the issue comes in with the title. The robos are just too custom. There are just too many goddamn options. You can create such uniquely powerful combinations in this game that no matter what 2 robots are fighting, the battle is probably going to be very polarizing to one side. When you have insane explosions and massive guns, any interaction will turn into just trying to get your bullshit to land first. This game was never meant to be a fighting game though. It was meant to be an adventure about vaguely erotic robots. But Nintendo was not satisfied with the erotic potential in this fighting game. And with the DSi having its very own camera, inspiration struck. Photo Dojo is a fighting game that if released in the modern day would be absolutely abused on social media. Take picture for taunt. Photo Dojo was a Nintendo game intended to show off the potential of the Nintendo DSi's camera function. Because how else were we expected to figure this shit out? This isn't a fucking DS. With the DSi's camera, you would take pictures of yourself doing various poses to emulate the moves you would have your characters do in a fighting game. And once you've completely created your own fighter for yourself, you get to play an incredibly basic fighting game. It's clear that this was mostly a tech demo and didn't have much thought put into the fighting game aspects, making it similar to Custom Robo in that way, but instead of having too many options, there's not enough. Each character can only move, crouch, jump, and attack in a couple of different directions, and the only move that's different from character to character is the down attack. So no matter how many characters you make, they'll all feel the same. There's also a desperation move that you unlock when you get to low health that also varies from character to character, but they're all basically just win buttons, so on top of feeling terrible to get hit by because you just lose, they honestly don't feel that varied. And that's basically all you can do. I mean, I guess you can taunt. So, as you can tell, it's clearly an incredibly basic and boring fighting game. But just to make sure no one can have fun at all, you and your opponent have to hold the DS at the same time. Why did they even slightly think this was a good idea? The DS had download play. Let us do that. Why the fuck would I want to be fighting for control of the DS with a sibling? And not only could you just take it away if you were losing, but you can easily reach the button for your opponent's taunt or desperation move, making it much easier to further sabotage them. And not both sides of the DS have a D-pad, so someone has to use a button D-pad. And I can't use the naked version of my fighter when I'm playing with a sibling, and I can't coerce anyone else into playing this game with me. Fuck this game. So I think it's pretty obvious at this point Nintendo wasn't putting a lot of work into their fighting games, since they had Smash Brothers. I mean, Super Smash Bros. Was all Nintendo needed at the end of the day. It features all their franchises, and it's unique enough to give Miyamoto a semi. But there was still a Nintendo series that could warrant its own entire fighting game. Pokken Tournament! Finally fulfilling Pokemon fans' fantasies of getting to play out the epic fights in the anime in an actual game. It was a game fans had been begging for a really long time. And understanding the demand, Nintendo, Bandai Namco, and the Pokemon Company were taking this very seriously. They even managed to get it into EVO, which is the biggest fighting game tournament every year. Pokemon, as always, was being criticized at the time. The turn-based battles of the Pokemon games were coming under fire for being too basic in the modern day. So, the Pokemon Company decided to make a direct response and created Pokken Tournament, finally letting the fans feel like they were playing the anime. And they didn't just make some basic 2D or 3D fighting game. They went all out and created an entirely new system called Phase Shift, where the match switches between 2D and 3D fighting, which is admittedly a little confusing because you're not exactly sure when it's gonna happen. But it's still kind of interesting when you start to figure it out. It'll never make perfect sense, but it keeps matches interesting. The roster is great though. It's got a ton of beloved Pokemon, and they all have incredibly dynamic movesets with all kinds of move references, and it really feels like you're playing as the Pokemon. They put a ton of care into all these movesets and made them feel faithful to how you think Pokemon moves would feel in real life. But that right there is the one problem with this game. If you look at Pokemon moves, there's an aspect of them that you probably didn't consider before. Attract, Baby Doll Eyes, Charm, Captivate, Tail Whip. They're generally long range. And when it comes to fighting games, excessive range can come with issues. In fighting games, long-range zoning moves are generally used sparingly. And while having some zoning is important to fighting games, it becomes a problem in overabundance. You can have range characters and even brawling characters with zoning options in any fighting game. But when there are too many zoning options in a game, nobody approaches each other and you just end up trying to hit each other from across the stage. And at that point, just play an FPS. And when pretty much every character has such a powerful zoning option, it leads to tournament finals that look like this. ARMS is so terrible. However, let's give ARMS a fair trial. ARMS was released back in June 2017 and was among the very first games announced for the Nintendo Switch back during the very first Switch presentation in January 2017. A lot of people were initially excited to see Nintendo creating yet another brand new IP after the success of Splatoon. Sure, we hadn't seen much of the game, and while bigger fighting game players weren't super excited for it, the same was true of Splatoon with the larger shooter community, and that turned out great. So, countless brand new Switch owners went to purchase ARMS when it was released, and the next joke writes itself. Actually, it didn't initially release to terrible reviews. There was a lot of people that were having fun with ARMS on release, but that was all the fun anyone ever had with the game. ARMS did have some fun modes and interesting characters to play. There's plenty of side modes, a single-player campaign for each character, you can stare at Twintail's character model, and of course, the regular fighting game mode. But, as everyone knows, there was nowhere near enough content to sustain a fighting game long-term. For a fighting game to remain something people play for a long time, it either needs to have one of the greatest fighting game systems ever conceived, or have a lot of side content that players will enjoy doing when the grind versus battle starts to weigh them down. Obviously, top players of fighting games probably aren't playing the side mode super often, but what matters is if you want casual players to play the game enough to want to become professionals, you need engaging side modes to keep their attention. But technically, there are about as many modes in this game as there are in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, so why don't any of these modes work like they do in Smash? The concept is bad. Range. Everything is about fucking range. No matter what the mode is, everything is played from across the map, which forces you to play in a very specific way. You can't play too fast and aggressive because they can punish you for any mistake you make no matter where you are, but you can't play slow and defensive either because no matter what you do, your opponent can reach you. So you're stuck playing at this very specific and awkward pace because any variation will result in getting hit. And you may think that the various characters would allow you to be able to actually express your own playstyle, but every single character is the exact goddamn same. game, with one, maybe two things differentiate them. So no matter what mode or character you play, your playstyle will not change outside of maybe I jump a little bit more or maybe I dash a little bit more. It doesn't affect the way you throw your arms because it all revolves around the type of arms you choose. And you may think the type of arms you choose would have some type of playstyle expression, but you're gonna figure out pretty quickly that electric attacks are broken and only use those. So it sucks professionally too, but hey, maybe it could be fun just casually with friends with all kinds of wacky items and stuff to play. But the items suck as well because there's only two types of bombs and two types of effect fields, and neither of them are that impactful. And people online keep telling me Twin Tail isn't real, so that's not fun anymore either.
Is love too much to ask for?
It's just a flawed game. I'm sure there's not that many people who hated their time with ARMS, but I am sure that there is not a lot of people who want more time with ARMS. Any attempt to reinvigorate the game just fell flat on its face. They tried to add new fighters, but nobody cared. In fact, I bet there's a fair chunk of you who own ARMS and have no clue who Misango is. They were hyping up this graphic novel for the game, but that just got canceled. They did multiple events and marketing campaigns that were pushed out to try and save it, but nothing worked. And as their last try, they added Min Min to Smash, and she immediately became the most hated character in the game. Just further proving that nobody wants to play with the ARMS playstyle. It was just a failed game all around. Nintendo just tried too hard to overhaul the whole genre and take it in a whole new direction, which is the problem with most of these games. Nintendo did succeed once in taking the fighting game genre into an entirely new style of gameplay. So whenever they made a new fighting game, they always wanted to do something entirely new again. But fighting games aren't designed for massive overhauls. Any minor change in the mechanics of a fighting game can make it already feel like a brand new game, which means one new mechanic could kill an entire fighting game. So completely changing the mechanics from the ground up means that you need to make sure every decision you make doesn't kill the game. And while Smash did get lucky once, it's unlikely to ever happen again. And while from all this, it may look like Nintendo just doesn't have the skills to make a good fighting game, but I honestly think their problem is they're overqualified to make a new fighting game. Nintendo normally only does one of two things when making a game. They either are making a sequel to one of their filler series and do the bare minimum,
Would it kill them to actually try on the next Mario sports game?
or they shoot for the stars, making something unlike anything you've ever seen before, completely innovating the game genre. But you just can't do that with a fighting game. The genre of fighting games is not built for an overhaul, and while it's not impossible to do, as they have shown, it's something I would consider to be on the same difficulty level of inventing a new religion. Most religions are slight offshoots of one another, and most people have already identified with the one they believe to be true. And the reason they're all very similar is because people want very similar things to come from religion. And any attempt to make your own religion from the ground up would be against what people want, and in some cases, being very against what people want. Is ARMS considered a cult? Probably, but that's not my point. What I'm saying is that people don't want ARMS or Pokken Tournament, or even Joy Mech Fight. They just want to pray to Jesus the same way they always have. And all this is just to say, Super Smash Bros. Is the equivalent to Mormonism in the fighting game community. So, Nintendo fighting games are ass. But hey, maybe it's just a testament to how good they are at making video games. And hey, maybe one day they will get enough people to join their cult and make another successful fighting game. But either way, this does confirm Masahiro Sakurai is a prophet of God.